All right. I think I'm put together now, maybe. All right, I think I told you all. Go ahead.
Quick question. So on the Canvas, on the chapter 11 video, it said
Yes.
it was due Wednesday, but on the due date, it said it was due last night.
That's just to put it on the calendar.
Okay.
Don't worry about the due date, just do it.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay. For the chapter 11, just do it, okay? I'm not terribly worried about the due date. I think I told you all a week or two ago that I had a cousin who, or it's actually my cousin's wife, who was in the hospital for 4 months with COVID. She is the physician who died. She died on Friday. That's been in the news. I don't know how much you guys watch the news, but Rebecca Shadowin from Bowling Green. So on Thursday is her funeral. So I will post a lecture. We will not, bottom line is we will not meet in person on Thursday so that I can go to her funeral. But I will post a video covering the material that we would have covered that day in class. So, but if you're so inclined, say a prayer for the family. It was very hard. Very, very hard for them. And I could not believe the ugly things that people said on the social media, because the governor mentioned her twice actually, and the news stations here in town, carried the story, and the Bowling Green Press carried the story, and people wrote ugly comments about she didn't die of COVID-19. Nobody has COVID-19 for 4 months. It's like not an active infection, but the damage that the infection causes can last 4 months, can last your lifetime. They're finding that I think it's 25% of college athletes that get COVID have lingering heart problems. That's pretty dramatic. You would think college athletes ought to be in pretty good shape. Their heart should be in good shape. So it's kind of frightening. So please take care of yourselves and each other. Okay, so we've been talking about evolution, and I think this is about where we stopped yesterday. I'm not used to having class days in a row. I always think it's been 2 days, but it was just yesterday. So population, we've said, is this group of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Generally, it's considered an interbreeding group. It is the smallest unit of biology that can evolve. Individuals cannot evolve. Families don't evolve. Populations evolve. And I keep coming back to that because it's a really important point. Okay? So we often talk about population genetics when we're talking about evolution, because that then focuses on populations as the evolutionary unit. So we look at the genetic makeup of populations over time. Now in lab tomorrow, okay, let's back up 1 second. What's due tomorrow? What's due today in lab?
Squirrel data.
Your squirrel data. For me to be able to help you, and for my colleagues to be able to help you tomorrow to do the statistics for your lab report that is due next Wednesday, we got to have the data. So if you don't send us the data, we're not going to have the data so that we can help you go through the statistics. Okay? So you have to send us your data. So remember that one of the points in Darwin's theory of natural selection is that there is pre-existing in the population individual variation. If you don't have this individual variation, there can be no evolution, because evolution acts upon these individual variations in the population. Not all of the variation is heritable. If you can't inherit it, if it's due to environmental conditions, then that's not heritable. But only the genetic component is relevant to natural selection. So that's why I keep putting these things up over and over again. First of all, the unit of evolution, and here we're talking about something called microevolution. We're talking about a single population, okay? requires pre-existing variation in the population. It does not cause the variation, and that's one of the common misconceptions that people have about microevolution. Evolution doesn't cause the variation. Evolution acts upon the variation. The variation has to already be here. So we got a bunch of ladybugs here. What are some of the variations you see?
Some of the dots on the
How many
board,
dots they have?
Some are bigger than others.
Size? Color? So all those are variants, most of which are probably genetic, can be inherited from one generation to the next. We say that a population is polymorphic. What does poly mean? Many. Morphic means shape or appearance or whatever. Polymorphic for a characteristic if two or more morphs or forms are present in noticeable numbers. Okay. Noticeable, not like 1 in a million or something. It has to be a reasonable number. So, remember the sources of genetic variation. A few of you missed this on the exam. Most of you got it, or got at least 3 of them. There are 4 sources of genetic variability: mutations, crossing over, independent assortment, and sexual reproduction. Evolution requires the pre-existing variation. I keep coming back to that. So what we do, and what you're going to do in lab tomorrow, this is what I was getting to when I started talking about lab, is we're going to do an experiment in lab tomorrow, and I don't think I posted it yet. I need to do that. The lab, I'll have handouts, but I need to post it or send it to you so you can look at it ahead of time. We have a lab where we are going to calculate these allele frequencies. So if you have a calculator, bring it to lab tomorrow. If not, you can probably use your phone as a calculator. Okay. So one way we describe this is using the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation. We define microevolution as a generation-to-generation change in population frequencies. That is, we actually literally calculate the frequency of each allele in a population, and then you see if that changes from generation to generation. If it changes, we say microevolution has taken place. If it doesn't change, we say there has not been microevolution. So this is how we do it. It's calculated from the allele frequencies, which are expressed as p squared, 2pq, and q squared. So it's just a mathematical equation. So basically what it's saying, p plus q equals 1. What we're assuming here is that we're talking about a character that only has 2 variants. You either are tall or you're short. You are either blue or you're green, or whatever the 2 things happen to be. But this is an ideal, realize this is an idealized situation. But we're saying there's only 2 variants. And we're calling those 2 variants, those 2 alleles, P and Q. And since there's only 2, they have to add up to 1. Now, make sure you understand what frequency is. Frequency is the partial over the total. It's the same as percentage, except you don't multiply by 100. So if we were to say that everybody in this room either has brown hair or blonde hair, we put everybody in those 2 categories. And we have 20 people, and 12 people have brown hair and 8 people have blonde hair. And we don't take no other colors, that's it. We would have to know individually what the alleles were. And that's where it gets a little more tricky. Because here we're talking about alleles. So we're talking about genotype, not phenotype. Okay? So P plus Q equals 1. P plus Q squared equals 1, right? If you square both sides, still equals 1, basic algebra. if you multiply this out, you get p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. Okay, quadratic equation. All right, and what ends up happening is p squared is the frequency of homozygous dominant individuals. 2pq is the frequency of heterozygous individuals. And q squared is the frequency of homozygous recessive individuals. Just hang, I know this is probably not making any sense right now, just hang with me for a minute, okay? Usually it's easy to calculate the number of recessive individuals. Why is it easy to count the number of recessive individuals? What?
Usually there's less of them.
Because, well, not necessarily. Used to be among people of European extract, blue eyes were more common than brown eyes. It's recognizable. You can tell when an individual in a population has the recessive trait because they exhibit that recessive trait, right? So all the individuals who have the recessive trait make up q squared, okay? So if you can measure the number of individuals, we can determine what q squared is in this equation. So we'll have to come back to the, you'll be doing this in the natural selection lab that we're going to do tomorrow in lab, but we haven't done it yet. Okay, so we're going to use that equation then ultimately to solve Hardy-Weinberg. You will learn a lot more about using the Hardy-Weinberg equation when you take ecology because they use it a lot. So we'll go through it maybe on Friday. If you'll remind me, we'll do that on Friday, since I won't be here Thursday. All right. There were 4 contributors to genetic diversity, right? Turns out that there are 4 causes or 4 mechanisms of microevolution. Those 4 mechanisms are genetic drift, gene flow, mutations, and natural selection. Okay? So if on the next test I were to say, name the 4 mechanisms of microevolution, you would respond gene flow, genetic drift, mutation, natural selection. Which one of those is common to the 4 contributors of genetic variation? Mutations. So mutations are the ultimate source of all variation. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk just a little bit about each of these. I'm going to move this out of the way here. So genetic drift has some similarities, and people get it confused with natural selection sometimes. It's a change in the gene pool. First of all, you have to have a small population, and the change has to be due to chance, not because one characteristic is selected for over another. It differs from natural selection. It only occurs, like I said, in small populations, and it has nothing to do with the ability to survive or reproduce. So here's a little bit of an example. It's not a great one. But in the first generation, if we analyze this population, if we counted all the big R's and little r's in this population, we would come up with a frequency of big R of 0.7 and a frequency of little r of 0.3. How do we do that? Well, big R, let's count big R's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 big R's, right? How many little r's? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? How many total alleles? 20. If you went 14 divided by 20, what does that equal? The partial over the total. That would equal 0.7. And if you took 6 over 20, that would equal 0.3. If you multiplied those numbers by 100, you get the percentages. You get 70% and 30%. Everybody okay with that? All right. So that's how you get the frequency. You literally count how many of each one you have. So in this generation, in generation 1, you have a P of 0.7 and a Q of 0.3. In the second, in what happens is, let's say there's a hailstorm. A hailstorm is a chance event. It is going to randomly take out certain parts of the population. Okay? It's not selecting one because it's stronger than the other, or because the color is more attractive to insects that pollinate or something like that. It is simply chance, pure chance. So the hailstorm takes out these 5 plants. And so the plants that are left reproduce and produce generation number 2. And in generation number 2, we end up with a P of 0.5 and a Q of 0.5. If you counted them all up, you would have equal numbers of big R's and little r's. And that occurred not because white was better than red for some reason. It's simply because of chance. Then when this generation grew up, only 2 plants survived. Let's say there was a fire and it happened to destroy all the plants except these 2. And those 2 random plants that happened to be left were both autosomal dominant or homozygous dominant. When they reproduced, all of the offspring were big R, big R. And that left you a P of 1 and a Q of 0. But this only happens if you have a small population. If you have a big population, even random events usually don't cause this kind of drastic change in your population. So, genetic drift, you got to have a small population and you got to have random events. And those are usually what we think of as disasters. Fires, storms, floods, things like that. Now, there are 2 specialized cases of genetic drift that we usually look at. One of these specialized cases is called the bottleneck effect, which is an example of genetic drift. It generally results from a very drastic reduction in population size. When you think of bottleneck, literally think of a bottle. And there's a picture on the next slide. Think of a bottle. You got this population, but at the very end, you only have a few. So here's our bottle. And in this original population, it looks like, what's the ratio of blue to white in this original population? How does it look? Maybe a little more blue, but it looks fairly even. Okay? And what about yellow? There's a few yellows in there, kind of spread out. But if something happened, and I always use the example of, let's say there's a peninsula. You guys know what a peninsula is? Like an island that has one connection to the mainland. And let's say there's a fire a mile in on the peninsula, and you have a herd of deer, okay? Only the deer that were close to the connection to the mainland are going to survive. All the other deer are going to get wiped out by this fire. Not because the brown deer survived better than the white deer or whatever it happens to be, but just because of where they happen to be located at that moment in time. And it would be random. And so you might have a population that's 80% brown, but near the connection, to the mainland, at that particular point in time, you might have had 3 white deer and only 2 brown deer. And so those are the ones that happen to survive and then repopulate. So a bottleneck occurs when your surviving population is not reflective of your original population. And it's due to random chance. It's not due to some characteristic that made them better able to survive. Okay. This is a big problem with endangered species because their populations have become so small that their gene pools are very, very limited. They are doing all kinds of things, the big they out there that do things, the zoologists and zookeepers and that kind of stuff that are trying to keep these populations alive. But like I said, the problem is there's so little genetic variability, it's really hard to keep these animals alive. So one of the things they've done that's kind of controversial is to introduce other species. Like if we said a species is, you have to be able to reproduce, well, in nature, but if you have an artificial situation, you might have reproduction between 2 species. Like ligers, you guys have heard tigers and lions normally don't see each other ever in the wild. But if you have them together in a zoo, they might mate, okay? So what they've done for some of these large mammals is cross them with another animal that it will reproduce with, trying to maintain as much of the gene pool as they can to keep them alive. The bad news is the chances of us keeping these large mammals long-term that are near extinction are very, very poor. The chances of, the panda actually surviving 300 years from now is pretty dim. Maybe in zoos, but a lot of the large endangered animals are not going to make it, no matter how much money we put into saving them. They have become the face of World Wildlife Federation and other groups, but most of the efforts actually go into saving plants and smaller animals because the chances of actually saving the big ones is pretty slim. Okay, this is another category of genetic drift. We're still talking about genetic drift. It's called the founder effect. You guys know what a founder is? It's kind of an old English term that used to describe basically orphans who were kind of left more or less to die. But the founder effect in this case, I guess maybe that was a foundling. The founder effect is genetic drift in a new colony. So what happens is a small number of a population starts a new colony, which means you have a lot less genetic diversity. Okay, how many of you have heard the term Irish potato? Potatoes are not native to Ireland. My mother used to use the term, but she used it to distinguish between regular potatoes and sweet potatoes. Okay, she would say Irish potatoes. Okay, potatoes are native to North and South America. The explorers who came to the New World in the late 1400s, 1500s, 1600s took potatoes back to Europe. And what they found was that Ireland in particular was a tremendously great place to grow potatoes. So within a couple of generations, potatoes became staples in the diet and also in the economy of Ireland. The problem came when there was a blight. The blight is a fungal disease, and it so happened that the potatoes that were taken to Ireland happened to not be resistant to the blight. So when the blight hit, wiped out 90% of the potatoes in Ireland. It also hit the United States, also hit all of North and South America, But the potatoes there, they may have only lost 20% of the potatoes because most of the potatoes were resistant. It just happened that the ones that they took to Ireland were not resistant. So when it started a whole new population in Ireland, most of the potatoes were not resistant. Think about the effects of that. Caused a famine, caused lots of people to die, caused tremendous amounts of immigration. Many of us can probably trace some of our roots back to people who immigrated from Ireland. People from Ireland who came to the United States in particular were not well received at the time, which is hard for us to imagine today, but they were considered dirty and nasty and were not welcome into the United States. Okay? So that's an example. There are also some issues with human health that are increased among isolated populations. There are populations of Amish that where polydactyly, where having extra fingers and toes, is very, very common because they're very inbred. A small number of people establish a colony, and you end up with a high incidence of a particular character. Another one would be the Blue people. You guys have heard of that? Blue people of Appalachia. Kentucky, kind of far southeast Kentucky, and I think Virginia, and I don't know about Tennessee and North Carolina, kind of in that area. There are people. There's a larger than normal group of people who have methemoglobinemia, which causes your skin to have a bluish tinge to it. So those kinds of things can exist in these populations in larger numbers. Okay, so that was genetic drift. So what's the difference between genetic drift and natural selection? Okay, genetic drift requires small populations.
By chance.
And it happens by chance, not because one trait has an advantage over another trait. In natural selection, there's some sort of benefit for one trait over another. Okay, gene flow has to do basically with interchange with another population, which tends to reduce the genetic differences between populations. Either individuals or gametes leave a population and go and join another population. This happens a lot, if you think about it, with certain populations, again, of large mammals, where the male is kind of, once if you have a kind of matriarchal society, I think elephants are this way and some kinds of bears are this way. When the cubs grow up, the males get excluded from the population and they're from the family group, and they're sent out because they don't want inbreeding. Now, they're not thinking that, obviously, but that's a result. Gametes can include pollen. Pollen from plants travels from one area to another area. How does the pollen travel? What? By bees, by insects, by birds, by bats, also by the wind. So, all of those can carry gametes or individuals from one population to another. Because humans are now traveling and mating with individuals in different populations, gene flow has become an important agent of evolutionary change in human populations. Within a few more generations, the concept of race may not even be there, because individuals are mating across different groups. So this is a computer-generated picture of a woman who was created by mixing several different races. So there are certainly populations who choose not to intermingle, so to speak. There are people with some really bizarre ideas that choose not to integrate with people of other groupings, which is a shame. because we certainly have a lot to teach each other. Okay. So that's gene flow. Mutation, we've already talked about, is changes in an organism's DNA. This is the ultimate source of all genetic variability. Each individual mutation has very little effect, but it's the accumulation of lots of mutations over time that have an effect on the population. And then we come back to natural selection. So what are the 4 mechanisms of microevolution? Genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, natural selection. Natural selection is the only one that promotes adaptation. In other words, the next generation is better suited for today's situation than today's population. Does that make sense? Because that's who survives and reproduces. Okay. Darwinian fitness, you probably heard the term survival of the fittest. That is not a term Darwin ever used. And fittest does not mean the tallest, the strongest, the fastest, the most good looking. That's not the definition of fitness. The definition of fitness is who contributes the most genes to the next generation. In other words, whoever has the most, turns out, grandchildren. He who has the most grandchildren wins. Because you have to not only produce offspring, you have to produce offspring that are fertile. And we'll get more into that later. Now, when we look at natural selection, there's 3 different general outcomes of natural selection. Natural selection can be what we call directional. If you think of a typical bell curve, and we got a population, in this case, a population of mice, it looks like, okay? And our original population, you know, you have the fewest on the 2 edges, and then you have the most individuals in the middle, typical bell curve. What can we immediately say, think about this a minute, what kind of genetics does this represent? What does a bell-shaped curve tell us about the genetics of color in mice? Do you remember?
Most are in the middle, like a mix of the 2.
Okay, but why? Remember we talked about the non-Mendelian genetics, the different kinds of non-Mendelian genetics, pleiotropy. What was the one that gives us bell-shaped curves? Polygenic. What this means is more than one gene is responsible for color. Okay, good. So what has happened is we have an original population where most of them are kind of an intermediate. If the conditions change, let's say we're talking about a population in Canada, all right? And in 1900, this represented the color pattern of these mice in Canada. What has happened from 1900 to 2020? What's happened to the climate in Canada? What? It's hotter. It's warmer. So what does that mean in the wintertime? What is there less of in the wintertime? Snow. Okay? So it used to be these mice would have the advantage in the wintertime, and these mice would have the advantage in the summertime. Okay? But if we have a gradual shift in temperature and we no longer have a whole lot of snow, then these mice aren't going to have an advantage anymore. So we have what we call a directional selection, where the whole curve shifts one way or the other. Okay? And that's called directional selection, where we have in favor of an extreme phenotype. Okay? So that's the first kind, first outcome of natural selection. The second outcome is diversifying selection. Sometimes it's called disruptive selection. And this is kind of what happened with Darwin's finches. If you look at the finches on the mainland, there were all kinds of food sources. So birds with intermediate beaks could probably eat, they could find something to eat better than the ones on the very edges. Okay? But once you went to the individual islands that might only have one food source that the birds could use, you end up losing the middle in favor of both extremes. So the long pointy beak becomes a benefit, and the short fat beak becomes a benefit. But the intermediate beak can't find any food. Maybe this island had two food sources. This pattern, this outcome, is the one that is most likely to lead to speciation, two different species, because you're separating your population into two. The third outcome is called stabilizing selection. And in this case, the middle becomes even more common. You lose those extremes. And the best example of this that I know is human birth weight. Trying to get these all to come up. Okay, human birth weights. When you think of somebody as having a baby, what do you think the birth weight, healthy birth weight, is going to be?
6 pounds.
Around 7.5 pounds. Okay, somewhere in that neighborhood. 6 3/4 to 7.5, 8 pounds, something like that. What would cause babies that are smaller than that? And now let's think pre-health intervention. Let's think pre-NICUs and all that kind of stuff, okay? What would cause those babies to not survive?
The mother not getting the proper nutrition.
Okay, if they didn't have enough nutrition. They're underdeveloped. Perhaps because they were what? Premature. So their organ systems weren't developed enough to survive outside the mother's womb. I can't hear you.
They can get sick easier. She said they can get sick easier.
They get sick easier. They don't have the resilience. Okay? Anything else? That covers probably the most reasonable. Lack of nutrition. That can be because the umbilical cord collapses. Okay? So all of those reasons, a baby might be very small and might have a harder time surviving, right? Okay, now let's think about on the other end. What would cause a 10-pound baby to be less likely to survive? It may get stuck. Now, the reality is women, most women can give birth to a 10 or 11-pound baby naturally. It's not, I'm not going to say it's easy. Mine were right at 7, plus or minus 3 ounces. So, but it can, it certainly had been done over time, and we don't like to suffer much today, but it can be done. But it is a possibility. Why might a baby be that large?
It's very close.
Okay, it may be a late baby. It may be post when it was supposed to be born. And one of the things that happens once you get about a week past the due date, which is 40 weeks is what we generally consider full term. Once you get to 41, 42 weeks, is the amniotic fluid starts to decrease. And that can be problematic for the baby's survival. So what else might make a baby? What would make a normal term, a 40-week baby or a 39-week baby, really big? A couple of things.
I'm not 100% sure if I'm right, but if the mother has gestational diabetes.
Exactly. If the mother has diabetes, that means the baby is exposed to high levels of sugar constantly, especially if it's not controlled. So the baby is subject to really high levels of glucose, which means it takes in lots of glucose, lots of more calories than a normal baby would. And after the baby's born, its body is not making enough insulin to handle. It makes everything go haywire, and the baby can actually go into insulin shock or a coma, because the mother was taking care of the blood levels of glucose in the infant, and when suddenly that stops, that can cause the infant a great deal of trouble. Okay, there's one other thing that I can think of that might make the baby really big, and that is hydrocephaly. Hydrocephaly is when there's a lot of fluid on the brain, and because a baby's head, the bones are not solidly together to allow the head to kind of collapse during the birthing process. Those sutures, we call them, are not closed. It can expand the head, and then the head being really large can then make it almost impossible to deliver the baby. So again, if the mother dies, the baby dies, generally. So for all those reasons, a very large baby may not survive. Again, specifically when there's no medical intervention. So that leads to what we call stabilizing selection, where the middle becomes more and more and more common. Okay. So this is just showing you all three outcomes of natural selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. Okay? Now, here we're just considering why natural selection acts in what we might think of as a really weird way. So we're going to look at sickle cell. Sickle cell affects about 1 in every 400 to 500 African Americans. That's a really high number. But the question is, why is it more common among African Americans? It's not very common among Asian Americans, among Caucasian Americans, Hispanic Americans. It's because the sickle cell allele, we think, confers resistance to malaria. And this makes it adaptive in the tropical regions that exist in Africa. How is malaria spread? Mosquitoes. Okay? The United States used to have a decent number of malaria cases every year, especially in the South. We don't have nearly as many today, but that's partly because we control the mosquito population. When you have sickle cell, it alters the physical nature of the red blood cell, and instead of being a donut shape, it can crystallize into the sickle cell shapes, and it doesn't go back. And when that happens, the cells can accumulate in capillaries. This is a very hard map to read from the projector, but if you look at it on your computer, you can see there's hash marks, which is showing where malaria is the most common. And this shows what areas of Africa and a little bit of Asia there, including India, where you see a high frequency of the sickle cell gene occurring in the population. There's not a perfect overlap, but there is a decent overlap. Notice that there's also some malaria that happens up here and some sickle cell disease that happens up here in Southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Greece. So around the Mediterranean. So what they think, my projection, or my thinking about it, is the malarial organism, which is a protist, it's not a bacteria, it's a protist, spends part of its life cycle in the red blood cell. You get bitten by a mosquito, and part of the life cycle of the malaria organism is in the red blood cells and the liver and other parts of the body. And if you carry the gene for sickle cell, but you don't have sickle cell, in other words, you're a carrier, you're a heterozygote, that means half of your hemoglobin, I think it's hemoglobin B, because there's hemoglobin A and hemoglobin B. I think it's hemoglobin B. Half of your hemoglobin B is going to be altered in this way. That's going to make it less hospitable for this organism that lives in the red blood cell. And so one of the assignments in the chapter 11, who's done chapter 11 assignment? One of them was about a woman who has been treated with CRISPR to remove the gene that causes sickle cell and replace it with what's called fetal hemoglobin. But they didn't treat her like her whole body. What did they do? Do you remember?
Didn't they like take it out of her bone marrow?
Yeah, they took out her bone marrow. They treated her bone marrow, and then they essentially did what they call an autologous bone marrow transplant. They took it out, treated it, put it back in, and then her body started producing fetal hemoglobin instead of the sickle hemoglobin. And she is much healthier. And that particular, there's actually an update to that particular recording that I had you listen to. But it's pretty amazing. But they think that's why it persists in that population. Now that we can treat malaria, number one, and it's not as deadly, and we can control, to some extent, mosquito populations, what's going to happen to the frequency of the sickle cell allele in all likelihood? What? It's going to decrease because it's no longer going to be a benefit in the population. In the 1960s, the World Health Organization began a campaign to eradicate the mosquitoes, and it used DDT. Now, unfortunately, some mosquitoes have developed resistance to DDT. And DDT causes lots of environmental problems. So they have backed off from using DDT. But since they've stopped using it, mosquitoes have lost that resistance. If you don't need it, there's no point in having it. It's not to say there aren't still some mosquitoes, but there's kind of a big fight between the environmentalists who don't want to see DDT used at all and the World Health Organization that wants to get rid of malaria about whether DDT should be used. The reality is DDT is relatively non-toxic to humans, and it's long-lasting. Those are problems in the environment because what did what was the problem with DDT? Do you guys remember? Or did you ever learn about it? Obviously you don't remember, you weren't around. I actually remember my grandfather having a big container of DDT in his basement back in the 70s, 60s and 70s. That's what almost caused the extinction, they think, of bald eagles and other large birds of prey. Because what DDT, we're going to look at in the ecology unit, DDT biomagnifies and it gets into the birds, and then the shells, the eggshells, became very fragile. And these large birds would sit on their nests with the fragile eggshells, and it would crack the eggshells, and then the baby birds would die, the birds that were still inside the eggs. So they banned DDT, and the bald eagles, and a lot of osprey and other large birds of prey have made a tremendous comeback. Now, if you think though about the areas of the world, particularly the internal parts of Africa, are not that close to the ocean. And if what the World Health Organization wants to do is go into huts and spray inside huts for mosquitoes, because most of the infections happen when you're bit by mosquitoes at night. Has anybody participated in some of the fundraisers like no, or what is it called? Something nets for. It's not no more nets. It's something to buy nets, because if you can keep children under or within a mosquito net at night, they're much less likely to get malaria. What it's going to require is a concerted effort on several different things at the same time. If you do the nets separately from where you spray the DDT, separately from where you have other treatments for malaria, you got to concentrate all those things at one time before you're going to be able to eradicate malaria. If you just keep doing it piecemeal, it's probably not going to work. You're going to have a concerted effort doing all the things at the same time to get rid of malaria. It is another disease that has been targeted by the World Health Organization for eradication. So we got smallpox, polio, measles, malaria are the ones they've targeted. But the problem is, when DDT was just used to control mosquitoes, it was pretty effective. They used it in the Spanish-American War because more soldiers died from malaria and yellow fever, which are both spread by mosquitoes, than died in the war. But instead of just using it to control mosquitoes, they started using it in large agricultural settings, spraying it from airplanes and stuff. And that's where you end up with lots and lots of environmental contamination. You're spraying it from planes, it gets into the groundwater goes to the rivers and stuff, and eventually to the oceans, and you end up with lots of DDT. If you have insects that are, even one or two, that are resistant to your pesticide, then they survive and they then reproduce, and their offspring are more likely then to be resistant to the pesticide. And so what you have to do, then the same thing happens with antibiotics. Anybody ever get a course of antibiotics for 2 weeks and you stop taking it after 4 or 5 days because you feel good? What that's doing the same thing that's happening here is the bacteria that are resistant or not as sensitive are the ones that survive. And the reason why you should keep taking it is to kill off those last ones that have some resistance. So what you have to do is really pound and get rid of all of them at the same time. And that's tough to do. Okay? So, wrapping up the chapter. Charles Darwin was named by A&E as the most influential person of the past 1,000 years. That's what he looked like when he was old. His main contribution was to Origin of Species. There are people who don't like Darwin. There are some myths about Darwin. He did become an atheist at some point, or perhaps an agnostic, but the reason had nothing to do with evolution. The reason had to do with his daughter died from some illness, and he prayed to God to heal her. She was not healed. He decided either there was no God or he hated God, one or the other. And so that's why he became estranged from God, not because of his theory of natural selection. There's also a myth that he recanted on his deathbed and became a Christian or something. The family says there is no truth to that story. So it's not a good idea to mythologize people. This is a timeline of what was going on in the world during Darwin's lifetime and before and after, which I think is somewhat helpful. Here we have the Revolutionary War in America. Here we have the French Revolution. And right in here is when Charles Darwin was born. And this is also when Gregor Mendel was born. Lamarck published his theory in the same year as Darwin was born. Lyell published in 1830. Darwin's trip was in 1831 to 1836. He began his notebooks. Notice that he didn't publish until 1859. He started working on it in 1837. So he waited 21 years to publish it, partly because he knew it was going to be controversial. But a guy named Wallace was going to basically get it out before he did. So he went ahead and published in 1859. And Mendel published his genetics papers in 1865, but they didn't see each other's work at that point in time. And that's the end of the chapter. Questions? Most people, I will say, in my experience, don't have too much trouble with microevolution once they actually learn what it is. Okay? It's really not terribly controversial. We can see it. It happens. Remember that microevolution is not even a theory, it's a biological principle. Natural selection is a theory, but what does the word theory mean?
Widely accepted.
It's widely accepted. It is generally accepted by all the scientists in the field. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of evidence for it. It is considered a theory and not a principle simply because it's still subject to change. Okay. We still got 10 minutes. But at the same time, I know it can be uncomfortable for some people. So if you have questions, now's a good time to throw them out there. It's going to get harder. If this is a concept that you're struggling with, I can tell you as we go into macroevolution and origin of Earth, that's going to become a little more difficult for some people. I'm not asking you to change your beliefs. And let me tell you, one of the questions I get just in casual conversation, I had somebody well, Ruby Tuesdays is closed now, but we were at Ruby Tuesdays years ago, and the waitress, was being friendly, and we were talking, and I said something about the college, and she said, "Oh, what do you teach?" And I said, "Biology." And she said, "Oh, you don't teach evolution, do you?" And my husband looking daggers at me because, of course, he doesn't want anything. And I said, "Well, yeah, sort of." And she was just absolutely horrified. So even in casual conversation, sometimes people get upset with me. But it does not challenge my faith. Okay, let's move on then to chapter 14. Okay, stop sharing. And share to chapter 14. So in chapter 14, we're going to talk about macroevolution a little bit. What's going to be the difference between microevolution and macroevolution? Microevolution, we're talking about a single population species. In macroevolution, we're talking about the big changes. Okay? Macro means big, micro means small. Okay? So macroevolution encompasses all the major changes that are recorded. So we keep coming back to what is a species. Ernst Mayr was the one who found this huge diversity of birds in New Guinea and kind of came up with the biological species concept, which is the interbreeding populations. What is sometimes difficult for people who are not scientists to understand species is that you can have very similar organisms that are different species, and you can have vastly different organisms that are the same species. So outward appearance is not enough to determine whether two individuals are the same species or not. So, and we can't use the biological species concept with fossils because, of course, they're dead. You can't reproduce when you're dead. And with organisms that reproduce asexually, it doesn't work. But when we're talking about defining species and whether or not organisms are the same or different species, there are reproductive barriers. Since we're defining species as being able to reproduce, there are barriers. And we kind of divide them into some different groups. We call some of them pre-zygotic. What does pre-zygotic mean? Think about the word. What is a zygote?
Before the egg and sperm meet.
The fertilized egg, right? Zygote is the fertilized egg. So there are barriers that occur before the egg is fertilized. And then there are post-zygotic barriers. So that would be after the egg is fertilized. Okay? So if we take individuals of two different species and we put them together, there are a variety of reasons why we may not get any offspring. Okay? And it starts with pre-zygotic barriers. So, and then there are those that are pre-mating. Okay, so these prevent mating from even happening. All right, so temporal isolation, habitat isolation, and behavioral isolation would prevent mating from even happening. Right? What does temporal mean? What is tempo in music? What's another word for tempo in music?
The pace.
The pace or the time, okay? So temporal means time. They may not be active at the same time. They may not mate at the same time. One might be nocturnal and one is diurnal. It could be one is active in June and one wants to mate in June and one wants to mate in September. There's any number of different temporal isolations. Habitat isolation. They might live on the ground, they might live in the tree. So if they don't live in the same habitat, they're not going to see each other. They're not going to mate. Behavioral isolation is an interesting one. Does anyone know what that's a picture of? Look at their feet. They heard of blue-footed boobies? They're found in the Galapagos. Hopefully I'll get to show you a video about the Galapagos. But blue-footed boobies, along with lots and lots of birds, do this very elaborate behavioral dance before they will mate. And it's really pretty funny. If you want to look it up, I'm sure you can Google video of blue-footed boobies, but they do this whole really weird dance before they'll before they will mate. They do the sky pointing thing, and some birds bring each other tokens of love and all kinds of stuff. So these behavioral isolation can prevent mating. One of the funny things that happened was, I told you we live in Frankfurt, and there's something called the Game Farm in Frankfurt. Anybody heard of the Game Farm? Been to the Game Farm? My kids practically grew up there. They were little when the Salado Center was built. And Daniel was actually the first kid to have a birthday party there. But they had two eagles, a male and a female, and both of them had been injured and couldn't fly. So they were kept in at the game farm on display. And I can remember people asking, well, do they have baby? Do they ever? And they were like, no, they can't do that because eagles have to do this big flying thing before they mate, and they can't do that, so they won't mate. Well, lo and behold, one day, there's a fertilized egg in the fake nest they have for the eagles. And I remember thinking at the time, if you're into Jurassic Park, there's one of the famous lines in Jurassic Park is nature finds a way. And then nature finds a way to mate even when you're not supposed to. And the big mistake the game farm made was they destroyed the egg instead of letting it hatch. And their thinking was that the eagles would not be able to properly care for the young. And I'm like, well, why didn't you take it to the zoo or somewhere, or put it in a nest with other eagles or something? But that's what they did. Okay, then, so those are temporal, habitat, behavioral isolation, precede mating. And then mating. You can have mechanical isolation, which prevents mating. That you may attempt mating, but things just don't work right mechanically. And this could be something like the pollen won't fit into the pollen tube. The pollen tube won't form right in the flower. Or it could be two animals can't copulate properly, so that the sperm can't get to the egg. And then there's also gametic isolation, which again means sperm and egg can't get together. Something prevents that. Post-zygotic barriers are kind of backup mechanisms. Post-zygotic barriers include hybrid and viability, which means it just doesn't survive. And that's what happens most of the time. Often though, if it does survive, there's hybrid sterility. Okay, so a horse and a donkey can mate and they produce a mule. And a mule is the hybrid. And most mules are sterile. They cannot reproduce. I used to ask, why do farmers want to have mules if they then can't reproduce? And somebody told me, but I kind of forget it. They have qualities that are different. I think they're sturdier than horses and less likely to injure themselves and die easily. But maybe they're not quite as stubborn as donkeys and behaviorally. Although I think, the term is stubborn as a mule, not stubborn as a donkey. So, but I've been told, but I never can remember which it is. Okay, so we'll stop there. Remember to get your squirrel data in to your lab professor. We're doing the lab tomorrow. And then Thursday, we will not meet in person. I will post a lecture online. And then we will meet again in person on Friday. Okay? Be safe.